All right, so all predators show some kind of prey preference, and this can be determined by their sensory capabilities, their foraging mode, their behaviors, and their morphology. So for example, Dolly Varden versus white-spotted char in Japan. I've got a really great movie that I'd love to show you guys called the Foodwebs movie, and it talks about these really cool studies in Japan where they were trying to figure out where these different fish were feeding and feeding on what, insects from the forest or insects from the stream. And basically that search image is really important also in predation. So a predator might just completely avoid a prey item that would be perfectly fine to eat because they weren't looking for it. So that what they happen to be hunting for or looking for, those prey items will be more at risk of predation than something, you know, kind of randomly coming by a predator. They might be surprised and not attack. The number of prey eaten tends to increase with prey abundance and density. So schooling is helpful, but schooling is also great if, you know, it's easy hunting. If you're a fish, you should be able to pick off a few items from a big school. And these three figures are from the book. They're called functional response curves, Holling's three curves. And basically they just talk about different types of predation related to prey density. So the number of prey consumed is on the y-axis of the kind of the center three graphs, and the proportion of prey consumed is on the y-axis of the three graphs on the right. And so type 1 curve, a functional response curve, shows that predation is related to prey density kind of until some saturation point. And then it doesn't matter how many more organisms they are, the predator can't eat anymore. Type 2 curve is a hyperbolic response to prey density. So it's similar. You see a steeper curve and then it kind of rounds off. And so it's kind of approaching an asymptote, similar to Michaelis-Menten kinetics, if you've heard of that. And then a type 3 curve, some more advanced predators will just wait until prey densities are high enough. So they're just like, oh, not worth it, not worth it, not worth it. And then all of a sudden they might can start consuming a lot more prey because the density got high enough. So it's just kind of thinking about these different models of how predators might work. And what are the effects of predation? Well, of course, you might be killed or injured. Predators can result in prey population suppression. They can result in local extinction. So if they get rid of their prey species completely, it can become locally extinct. They can force prey to restrict particular habitat uses. And we'll talk about all of these things in a little bit more detail. And then they can also alter the prey's foraging efficiency. So they can push them out of prime habitat, and that can cause lower growth. It can cause fitness. Just the stress of being preyed upon or chased can reduce your fitness and growth. And these alterations to behavior are part of the ecology of fear, which is a really interesting sub-area of ecology. And then, of course, predators can apply so much pressure on prey populations that prey can actually adapt. And via natural selection, new adaptations to avoiding predation can arise through evolution. There are some really cool studies about predators that live at the land-water interface. So like this water measurer, it can prey on items that fall into the stream from the terrestrial habitat. Say you're, grasshopper or moth or something, and you accidentally land in the stream and you're fluttering about, the water measurer can get you. But it can also prey on insects that are emerging as larvae develop and adults emerge and hatch. It can prey on hatching adults as well. So it's really cool. There's some really cool studies about these guys preying on the interface between water and air. And even things like light, like the moon, there have been studies on moonlight that can influence prey capture because there's more light available for predators to see their prey. Larger prey may escape capture, and so, if you're larger, faster, you have some adaptation, then you might escape capture, and then you might survive to produce more offspring. Okay, so real briefly, although this chapter doesn't go into competition much, it is an interesting interaction between species. And so I just wanted to kind of like lay this out, that for any given species, say this butterfly, there's an optimal range where that species is really abundant across some environmental gradient, right? And so there's some optimum. So you could say this is a temperature gradient or moisture gradient or whatever environmental gradient you're thinking of, there would be an optimal range. And there's this really nice normal curve, right? And then in the like too hot, too cold zone, you would have a zone of stress where the species might still be found, but less frequently. And then you'd have what's called a zone of intolerance where you just don't find them anymore. Okay, so this is how species are distributed across the landscape. There are just multiple environmental gradients that they're navigating at any time to just kind of just determine their distributions. So competition, and we think about these then normal curves for two different species. When those curves overlap for two different species, that's when competition happens. And so exploitation competition is when the one competitor can deplete the resources of another competitor, versus interference competition, where there's like direct contact or aggressive behaviors or territoriality between organisms. And so both types of competition can result in the divergence of those optimal habitats. So basically both species might shift to avoid that zone of competition. And this results in things like niche specialization. So they might choose to pursue different foods or different habitats, or they might pursue to work in a different season or a different time of day to avoid competition. And this is because multiple individuals of the same species or multiple species use the same or similar resources, and they're basically in the same niche. So resource partitioning is sharing resources, figuring out a way to share so that you can avoid competition. So here's some examples. It's a great figure, but I couldn't think of an aquatic example. But here's some birds. Imagine they're living in the riparian forest, and these are all different warblers. They all look pretty similar. They might feed on the same insects, but they're going to share resources by feeding in different parts of the tree. Okay, so this is how these 5 different species of warblers can share resources. Another example would be this net spinning caddisfly. It might partition resources by sharing parts of the rock. So, it can only make its net so big. And so its neighbor, might set up its net, downstream or nearby. And so they're partitioning the resources in the drift and trying to avoid competition with one another. You wouldn't want to set your net up, right downstream of another caddisfly just because you wouldn't catch much. So there can be both intraspecific competition, and so this is within a species. So territorial behavior has evolved in many species as a result of intraspecific competition. So like this male red-winged blackbird is staking out a territory, defending its nest and its mates from other red-winged blackbirds. And again, these fly larvae are competing for space on rocks. Notice they're not all lined up next to each other. They're kind of spread out. Then there's also interspecific competition. So this is just a classic example. It happens to be marine, but there are 2 species of barnacles, Chithalamus and Balanus, and it turns out that the thalamus population could be overgrown by the lower Balanus. But the thalamus are more drought resistant. And so they take over in the high tide, and they can kind of outcompete the Balanus because they're more resistant to the drought. This is a classic study of competitive exclusion by a guy named Connell, who I think we lost this year or last year, unfortunately, kind of a classic ecology study. All right, so some other species interactions, just real briefly. These are all types of symbiosis, living together, symbiosis. And the first one is commensalism. So commensalism, here's a salmon thrashing around, digging out a red. Bioturbation is kind of the result. And it's moving large rocks and gravel and sand. It's causing all the invertebrates that live in the gravel to drift, to let go and drift downstream. And then smaller fish might benefit from catching these drifting organisms. The salmon is not benefited or harmed. So in this case, the small fish are being benefited by the salmon's activities. The salmon is just doing its thing. It's just digging a red. And so this is a commensalism. An amensalism, in this example, a wading bird like a heron is walking around in the mud, crushing benthic insects, crushing little tubes and, burrowing insect channels and things. The bird is not harmed in any way. It's totally neutral interaction, right? But the insects are harmed. And so in this case, an amensalism is where one organism is harmed and the other is not affected. Then there are things like mutualisms. So this is a piranha. You might think of a piranha as a crazy predator, but they actually eat seeds in the forest, in the tropical forest. They are not really, I mean, they'll eat meat, yeah, but they're really adapted. Those jaws are adapted to crushing tropical seeds. And so the Amazon River frequently overflows its bank, and fish are adapted to living in the flooded forest. In fact, some species of trees will only fruit underwater to draw piranhas in because they're basically carrying their fruits and seeds around the forest and depositing them. And so these fish disperse seeds and eat fruits. So both organisms are benefiting, both the trees and the piranha. And that's called a mutualism. And then because I'm talking about the Amazon, I just have to throw in the freshwater Amazon River dolphin, which is amazing. So here's a few other mutualistic interactions. The water fern Azolla contains an endosymbiotic nostoc. There's a nostoc that contains the midge, Cryptopus nosticicola. There are hydra with endosymbiotic chlorella algae. There are diatoms with cyanobacterial endosymbionts and bacteria attached to the heterocyst of Anabina. So lots of ways to be a mutualist in the aquatic environment. And then some parasites. So I've talked about parasites. I'll just mention this one briefly again. Acanthocephalans, spiny-headed worms, really scary looking guys. They attack amphipods, which are scuds. The uninfected amphipods are typically benthic. They're just scuttling around on the bottom, eating. They're detritivores mostly. But infected amphipods, you can see the kind of pinkish worm inside the body, are positively phototactic, meaning they swim up to the surface of the water and they start thrashing around and they're attracting bird predators. And so then the birds are the next host for the worm. So the worm is trying to get into a bird by creating a zombie scud. So here is just for a little practice, a table where you can stop the video and you could try to write in what is happening to two different species if they're involved in a mutualism. Is one harmed, is one benefited, or not affected? And so for each of these cases, there are two organisms involved and they're either being harmed, benefited, or not affected. And so you can fill in all of these species interactions. So pause the video. Okay, so then after you've filled this in, I'll show you the answers. So here you can see there are lots of different ways to be positive, negative. Oh, one I didn't really talk about much, you probably had to look it up, was allelopathy, but that's when plants produce toxins that prevent herbivores from chewing on them. I should have mentioned that. Okay, so I'm gonna stop here and start again at Foodwebs.